Welcome to the Communication Workshop. I'm Abbey Wick. I'm the NDSU Extension Soil Health Specialist. So I work primarily with farmers, with other educators, including our county agents and our CS organizations, anyone that brings information out to people that are going to put it on the ground. So that's my role at NDSU.
My name is Tim Hamrich. I work in communications consulting. I have been hosting the Soil Sense podcast along with Abbey for the last over a year now, almost 2 years going on for that podcast, and I've been in communications for several years. When we talk about communications, our minds might rush to presentations. How do we put together a presentation, or how do we put together a blog post or social media? And we're going to talk about that. But a good place to start is anchoring this on real connections. How do we just facilitate environments that actually lead to real connections and real discussion? So very, very pleased to have not only Dr. Abbey Wick joining for this panel, but also Dr. Briese and Angie Johnson. So we'll go ahead and invite them into the panel conversation. And Abbey has already introduced herself, but maybe Lee, if you wouldn't mind joining us in introducing yourself, just give us a little bit about your background.
Hi, everyone. Lee Briese. I'm an independent crop consultant here in North Dakota, and I work directly with farmers, trying to help them evaluate the issues that they have on their farm and bring them science. And so I'm a science communicator on a daily basis, but most of my communication is one-on-one in person.
And you're going to get to see Lee's impressive yo-yo skills a little bit later in today. So we'll hold that for you for later. But Angie, joining us as well. Can you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Well, good morning, everybody. My name is Angie Johnson. I work for NDSU Extension. I am a county extension agent based in Steele County, North Dakota, so about 75 miles northwest of Fargo. And like Lee, I work directly with farmers and ranchers, just bringing that information, research information right to our producers here on the ground at the boots level, working side by side to do the best we can to improve any issues that they may be having and to make their quality of farming and ranching meet their needs. So welcome and thanks everyone for joining.
Great. Well, maybe a good place to start here is because we're all in this 2020 environment where we're trying to adjust our communication strategies to a virtual environment, is maybe just talking about a style. What does that look like? Lee, and maybe we'll start with you. What does that look like in communications, whether it's in person or virtual? How can you kind of bring yourself and make it more of a discussion?
Well, I think one of the things that I like to encourage people to do, or I try to do, is just communicate the way that I do on a regular basis every day. Whether it's in front of 600 people on a stage or 2 people in a shop on the farm, I just try to be myself and do the things that I do. And I'm a storyteller, so I like to do that type of thing. I like to tell stories that I point and are a little bit humorous. And sometimes if they're not humorous, well, that's all right. That's just me. That's what I do. I like to stick to what I do every day. I don't want to try to do things that I'm not used to, or I haven't done, or haven't practiced.
And I want to hone in on that point a little bit, Lee, if we can, is, how did you find that out about yourself? Have you always known that about yourself? I think a lot of us may be wondering, how do we find our own style of communication that is authentic to us?
I actually wasn't entirely aware of it. A few of my farmers were together with me one time, and they were joking, like, I wonder what story you're going to tell today, or I wonder what kind of analogy or metaphor you're going to come up with today. And I just had to kind of pause a little bit. What do you mean? He's like, well, you always use some type of metaphor or analogy or something to just make it make sense for us, something that we're more used to in common. And so then I really just started to think about that and hone in on that. It's like, okay, so that's what I do every day. Why don't I do that on the stage or in front of people or when I'm at a meeting? Because I practice that every day without even knowing it. So my advice is, ask the people you interact with every day. Ask your spouse, your friends, your coworkers, what really is my communication style? And I think one of the things is like understanding, don't do the things that you're not used to. If you're not the jokester every day, it's probably not the right thing to do.
I have made that mistake personally, trying to throw a joke in because I thought it would be good when I'd never tried that joke on anyone but my wife, who rolled her eyes and said it was a horrible idea. But I think a lot of it comes down to also understanding the audience. And Angie, you have worked with producers, in your area quite a bit. Can you talk about specifically with a farmer audience, what's important to understand about them, maybe ahead of any type of communication?
Sure. I want to, when I'm working one-on-one with those farmers, um, I I really need to seek to understand, right? I need to understand where they're at right now and where they want to be, because otherwise it makes it really challenging for me to work together with them to get them what they need. And so really asking those questions, and it feels like you're probing, right? But if you work at it and come from an approach in terms of it's coming out of caring. I'm asking you these things. It may feel like it's invasive, but it's because I care, because I need to get you the best information that's going to make the difference, to achieve the goals that you're looking for. So ultimately, seeking to understand and really just meeting them where they are. So if there's techniques or practices out there that Lee or I may disagree with that a farmer is participating in, but you know what, we need to meet them where they are and understand why they're doing them. Maybe they don't even understand a certain technique or why they're doing a certain practice. That's what grandpa did and that's what my dad did, and so I'm doing it. I don't know why I'm doing it, but I am. And so just helping them understand, maybe to learn a little bit more about what they're doing and their practices, and just being able to really to respect where they're coming from too. I can't just go in there and say, well, jeepers, you're doing this wrong. If you would just change this, it would fix things. That's really not our goal. Is we want them to learn and to capture that behavior change on their own. And I'm just lucky that I get to be a part of their toolbox and giving them different tools to select from to make those changes.
I think that is such an important point. And a lot of times we are in such a rush to get through our PowerPoint presentation that we don't actually think about, okay, where's the starting point here with the audience? And Abby, I know for you, you've done these cafe talks, which is a great way to sort of facilitate discussion and conversation. What's the secret to doing that? When do you know maybe, when it should be a PowerPoint presentation or a pre-prepared spiel, and when should it just be a discussion?
That's a great question. And I think I should maybe explain where the Cafe Talk started, because it came out of me moving to North Dakota from Virginia, not really knowing what the issues are here, what I should be presenting or what I should be talking about, not having an agricultural background. So I needed to learn about farming at the same time I was sharing information about soils. And so these ideas of a Cafe Talk where you can sit down and have a conversation and a discussion came about. I had something I needed to learn from farmers. They had something they could learn from me. And so I think that having those conversations really has helped shape the program. It's made soil health what it is today. It's made it about farmers. It's made it about the issues that they're having. If you asked me when I first started, what I would be covering, I would have told you salinity. I'm going to cover salts in the soil, salt affected soils, because that's what I was hired to do. But now most of the program is based on cover crops, reducing tillage, and other approaches. So listening to farmers and learning that from them is how we got to where we are today. So I would actually, in most cases, I would prefer to do a Cafe Talk. I would prefer to have those discussions because I leave that meeting with information that I can use. I'm not just sharing information, I'm getting information in return, and that helps shape the program. So honestly, if I can avoid a PowerPoint now and standing in front of people on a stage, I would do it. So I'm glad that, and that's probably why this virtual meeting is this way, is having these discussions, because we're all going to get something out of it, including us as hosts.
Yep, absolutely. Well, Lee, I want to hear, from you. You always seem to have some really good insights into the mind of the clients that you work with. As you're thinking about this, framing a conversation and really extracting those insights and listening, what tips can we share with others that might be helpful for doing the same thing?
Well, I think the important thing is to understand that you need to be listening, right? You're not just up there talking. And if you're going to have a communication is a two-way street. So be listening. And Angie talked about great ways to do this, in smaller groups and one-on-one. Abby was talking about doing it in a smaller group in a cafe. You can do this in large scale, 300, 400, 500 people. I've done it before. You make eye contact with people. You ask them direct questions and you look for that body language. Are they nodding? Are they yawning? Are they on their cell phones? This tells you all kinds of things. That communication is there. You're either losing them or you're gaining that audience. In today's age now, if I can keep people's interest and their eyes on me for the majority of my presentation, that is a huge win, because everybody's carrying a box on their hand that they can be distracted with. And the nodding, or if they disagree with you, I will ask an open-ended question to the audience. hey, does everybody think XYZ? And you'll see the different points of view across the room and say, oh, well, okay, this is not something that everybody agrees on. Okay, good. That tells me something. And then I will adjust. So I tend not to have a canned presentation. Like Abby said, if I need a PowerPoint because people expect it, it's usually pictures. And then again, I tell stories, but that's my way of doing things. And I can adjust my stories after I've talked with the audience and found what it is that they're interested in. I can tell my stories in a different way or tell a different story.
No, I think that's great, and we know it works well for you, Lee. Have you seen, what are some other styles out there that you've seen that you think, okay, well, that's not my style, but you've seen it be effective? Does anything come top of mind? I know I'm putting you on the spot here.
Yeah, no, I'm ready for that one. So a lot of scientists and communicators are very critical, right? They're very like, no, I don't have data, I don't have information, the science doesn't back that. That's a communication style. That's a personality style. That's a skeptic. It's fine to be a skeptic, and you can use that to your advantage. So as a skeptic, learn how to talk in the way that you think. So rather than saying, no, that won't work, we'll say, well, here's the claim, here's the evidence, and here's my assumption, or here's how I think this might work in the real world. That's still being skeptical, but it's not being negative or anti. And the same thing is true of a question from the audience. If somebody says something that you totally disagree with, you say, well, that's interesting that that's your experience. Here's what we've experienced. Here's what we've seen. Here's what we think. Here's where I think that's going to go. And so use your style, how you think about things, how you see things. Even if you're a skeptic in the negative, you can spin that and make that communicative.
Yeah. Well, Angie, as we've kind of moved to virtual environments, is there anything that you've seen or that you have participated in that has really worked? And we do have a question from the chat that you may want to speak to as well. I know Lee just mentioned about seeing if they're paying attention and looking at you, but is there any other body language that we can look to on an online format to make sure we're making that connection?
That's a great question, as I'm still learning to navigate presenting on Zoom, right? Because body language for me is everything. Watching that audience, like Lee said, he's a jokester. I think I am from time to time, and so trying to do that over Zoom and having all of your participants either no camera on or no mic on, and I can't hear or see anybody, it makes me feel like I just utterly failed and I need to rush through this presentation just to get it over with because it's so bad. So body language is huge. Watching people, it has been challenging. I'd be lying saying if I wasn't struggling with it, but I think we're all trying to learn what works for us in terms of presenting online. But I think one of the things that I've noticed that I've really liked is, even though I can't stand icebreakers, it's time to maybe start opening up a little bit and having some dialogue with your online virtual participants, because having those quick conversations and getting to meet people, it allows you to start thinking and start relating back and understanding where they're at, what they're coming from. So as a presenter, I feel a little bit more comfortable just knowing some background. So that was great that you had asked in the chat, everybody put where you're from. So it just kind of gives me an idea, even just seeing, okay, we've got some from down south, we've got participants from up north, just giving the presenters something of comfort to take and own and feel ready to march forward with talking.
Well, Abby, I think one of the challenges is giving up control, right? If we are going through a PowerPoint and we know we're starting at slide 1 and we're ending at slide 50, we have complete control, but that's not communication, right? So how do you actually give up some of that control, but still make sure it goes in a productive direction? I'm sure you've got some insights from the cafe talks.
Oh boy, I don't know that I do. I'm a listener by nature. And so for me to not have complete control of the meeting, it may not seem like it sometimes, is okay. I'm fine with sitting back and listening and letting that conversation go where it needs to go. However, when I hear information that maybe isn't quite right, or it's too based on personal experience and the science isn't there to back it up, then that's an appropriate time, I think, to come in and say, listen, we've done some work on this, or I know somebody that, at NDSU that's done this work, or somebody at another university that's done the work, or even another farmer, and to say, they had this experience and this is what they found. So weaving that into the conversation in a way that's not telling somebody, listen, what you said was wrong, because it's not wrong, but there's another angle to look at. So I think, I hate to call it a gatekeeper of some of the information, but as somebody that's hosting these things, to guide that conversation in a way that's productive and reduces the most risk for the most amount of farmers that's on that call. Because I mean, our job in extension is to reduce risk as farmers adopt new practices, because it's scary to go out and try a whole new practice on a quarter of land and then to hope it works because you heard from XYZ that it's going to work. But to reduce that risk, to bring in all the information so people can make the best decision they can for their operations, for their specific logistics that they have going on in their farm is kind of what I try to do. But yeah, I actually prefer to not have control in a lot of ways. I like to sit back and let other people guide the conversation and have more owners of that conversation or ownership of that conversation versus in a PowerPoint, I go home and I say, okay, well, I delivered this presentation today. After a cafe talk, I can say, we talked about XYZ today. And it feels more inclusive and more like a team effort versus just an individual venture.
All right. And I know one thing I've learned from talking to Lee ahead of this is Lee, you talk about, don't worry so much about having that control. Kind of let the conversation go where it might be. Can you talk about maybe some mistakes that you've seen other people make when trying to have a conversation, trying to connect with farmers that hasn't worked out so well?
I will in just a second, Tim. But one thing I did want to comment is that I'm watching the chat while we're talking, and we're getting that audience feedback, and that's very helpful right there. Watching that chat and that whole thing. So, that whole control issue, you don't have control in a conversation with other people. So just embrace it and work with it that way. Other failures, you put me on the spot here, boss. Do you mind if I jump into a question instead? So one of the questions,
this is a conversation, Lee.
Right. So one of the questions asked about, is it difficult to present abstract concepts without visuals? Okay. Now there are different ways to have visuals. Okay. Think about it this way. Yes, you can have your slides and your graphs. Those are your visuals that are they're common to you, but there are other ways to make visuals. That's just the stories and the aforementioned different ways that I talk about things. I'm using my hands right now, right? And it's not good with the screen, so that's not working. But one of the things is you can paint a picture or a story. You can tell a story, and you can paint those pictures and leave visuals with people that way as well. So make sure that you're doing that. I have several stories where I talk about dogs and leftovers from Thanksgiving and 5 food groups of soil health and things like that leave an impression or leave a visual in that person's mind. You're actually painting a picture for them. And actually that picture is more related to them than if you actually put your own picture up on the board. If you talked about someone's house or their porch, like with the dog story, talk about leaving leftovers in your porch. Most people think of their house or their porch or their childhood home or where they went for Christmas and Thanksgiving. They'll see that, and it's their dog. It's not just a random dog. So these things are personal and relatable. So when you paint that picture through words, it's very useful. And there are ways to do that with very difficult scientific concepts. You can paint those pictures through words.
I love the idea of word pictures, and it's such a skill that you can acquire, work at and acquire over time. I'm sure, Lee, as you're driving down the road through all the farmers you work with, you're kind of thinking through those. As you're thinking of them, how do you know, I guess, what the right one is to use? I'm just curious because you have the 5 food groups comes to mind because we talked about that on the Soil Sense podcast. But how do you come up with those? I guess is my question.
Trial and error. You try one out, and when you screw it up, change it or drop it, move on. I've made so many mistakes publicly. It's not that big a deal. Again, it's a communication thing. I'm okay with totally flubbing up in front of people. Do I like it? Absolutely not. I hate it. But it's okay because it happens. I put my foot in my mouth in a regular communication. What's the difference if I'm on stage or 5 people? When I find something that starts to work, then I expand upon it and move from there. So then you start getting some key things and factors. And again, it relates back to your style. Your style is critically important. If that's what you normally do, then use it and move forward. So telling stories is maybe not the only way to do this, but everybody can do word pictures through your own communication style. Practice with your friends, practice with the other people that you're going to be presenting with. Ask them questions. What do they think? Does it make sense? Is it too complicated? Is it too abstract? Are you talking about things that people don't really do? Like if we talked about a local card game here on this, it would not work well. Most people would not understand.
I'm glad you gave me personal permission to fail today, because I'm sure it'll happen multiple times. But that's a great point. I mean, we're all iterating and trying to make this better, and you have to try new things if you want to grow. A challenging question from the chat, and maybe I'll direct this to Angie at first, and then Abby and Lee, if you all want to jump in afterwards, because it is a tricky one. Is, what if you're trying to have a productive conversation, productive discussion, and people are trying to bring up off-topic questions or comments, especially if they're trying to bring it way off topic to something that's totally unproductive at all. Angie, how do you handle that, or how have you seen that handled? And then also Lee and Abby, if you want to jump in after Angie, please.
Yeah, talk about a tough question. I mean, this happens almost daily when you're having workshops or activities or any type of demonstration. Really, I would say you want to focus, what's your key message right now, right? And so let's use our parliamentary procedure, call to question, like what was the original ask or discussion point, and really focusing on that and allowing that other producer, yes, to know that we hear you. Can we get back to that? Can I get back to you one-on-one on that? If it's in a group setting, that's really challenging, because everyone wants their story heard, right? They want a piece of the pie, and they deserve a piece. We're there to truly listen and include everyone, but it can be so hard when things start to shift in a different direction and go off topic. It really causes, I know for me, anxiety. How do you focus? How do you do that? And so saying, what, I don't have the answer right now for that, but give me your contact information, or come on by and let's talk about it later when I can get you more information that you need. Just making sure that they know that their request or their question is important, but I just don't have the resources and tools to look at it right now.
Yeah, I think I can jump in, Lee, and then I know you've got some thoughts on this too. I've had that, and I'll give you an example, because sometimes learning through examples is maybe the best way to navigate this situation. So at some of the cafe talks when we first started them, there would be maybe a farmer or two that would show up, or a consultant, or another researcher or educator that would show up, and they would say, no till equals no crop. And that's a conversation stopper, right? I mean, that's like, oh man, what am I going to do in this situation? But then when I hear that, I first of all recognize that individual is there at a soil health cafe talk. So they're there because they're interested. So there's something under that comment that tells me that number one, they showed up. If they really felt that, they wouldn't be there. And then to listen to them, because I think, again, like Angie said, listening is our best skill. And then to ask them, maybe what experiences have you had that that have led you to that conclusion, or what have you seen that's resulted in that, that idea that no till equals no crop. And then sometimes not always responding with all the data and the information and the experiments and the research we have that says, yes, you can do this, or if you do X, Y, Z, you'll see this result. But then relying on some of those farmers in that conversation too, to say, well, I tried it on a field and it worked okay. Or I tried it and I had to tweak this about the system. So letting other people contribute to that conversation and to address that comment, because you're not the only one in the room that has to deal with that kind of statement. I mean, there are a lot of other people there that do believe in what you're doing, or in soil health, or in whatever the practice is, and they can be backup. Yeah. So I think that's another tool you can use. Certainly listen to their concern, ask more about it so that you understand it a little bit better, but then rely on some of your buddies at that meeting to help you kind of redirect that conversation into something more positive.
Great. And Lee, anything to add on to there as well?
That's one mistake I made several times early on in this process of learning how to do this. I failed to acknowledge that person, and both Angie and Abby talked about that, acknowledging them. When you don't acknowledge them, they will not stop. There's a reason why they got up and said what they wanted to say. They want to be heard, as Angie said. You need to acknowledge it. And I have done it as much too. I've been a little bit blunt a few times, and that's fine. Angie took a very side tack on that to say, I don't have information, I'll get back to you later. I will actually say, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm fine with talking about it later or afterwards, but the presentation is formed around this topic. And I think most people want to hear that. But acknowledging that person to say, thank you for your experience. I do want to hear more about it, but this is just not the time for it.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and that's a great demonstration of different styles too. I mean, the principle there is you want to engage that person, not ignore them. But you saw kind of two different styles between Angie and Lee in how they might handle it. And I also bring your attention to, exactly what we're doing here, trying to engage with questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So if you have any, please put them in there. We want this to be directly addressing your questions and issues that you're dealing with on a daily basis. And we want this to be not only a panel about discussions, but a discussion in and of itself. And now what about, translating all of this, because we've talked about a lot of principles, but specifically to online, to Zoom conversations, what needs to be changed, if anything? And Abby, maybe we'll start with you. As you were setting up this conversation, what needs to be different because it's online and what is the same?
Oh, I feel like when I first started doing the online cafe talks, I was nervous because I'm used to reading, like Angie said, body language, and I'm used to having a conversation. I'm used to not having to fill a specific amount of time with a discussion that's set, by an online meeting. But I think one of the tools that I've used, and I think it's been really effective in getting some of these discussions going, is I log on about 10, 15 minutes early. And I have co-hosts. I invite 2 or 3 or 4 other people to be on that as kind of leaders of that discussion with me. And so the 10 to 15 minutes before the meeting starts, we'll actually be talking about, what my 5-year-old did that morning and how he's going to Zoom bomb the meeting. And, I think we kind of get that personal conversation going so that people realize we're not just there to share information about science, but we are vulnerable too. And we will share things about ourselves and our personal lives and some of the things that maybe we're struggling with, and I think it's okay to poke fun at yourself. Sometimes I think that's one of, when we ask about our communication strategies, that's one of mine. I'm usually the first, if I get up on stage and I have a farmer panel, I'm the first one to drop the remote and the batteries go everywhere. And I'm the first one to make all those mistakes of tripping on the stage, and I just pave the way for everybody else. But that's my style. I'm happy to make those blunders before anybody else does, and to kind of acknowledge that and recognize it and then say, we're going to do the best we can and let's give it a shot. But I think that having co-hosts, so like, for example, that you're co-hosting, we're co-hosting this event together. We can have a conversation that fills in some of those gaps and takes some of the pressure off of having to be the only person hosting.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, I think it sets some great context too, just being vulnerable and being yourself and not feeling like, I know I made the joke earlier about how it's, local news. It's not local news. We're having a conversation and it's people. Most of you tuning in are probably tuning in from your home or your office. And we're just kind of people having a conversation, having a discussion. That's where real progress gets made. So Angie, maybe you could talk a little bit about that as far as how do you create a comfort zone when you're having a discussion online or otherwise, to making sure that people feel like they're being heard and that they can speak up?
It's a great question. I'm really glad you asked me. So we're in the business of caring and serving people. Service is ultimately what we do. And I think about what makes me feel good when I come out of a workshop or a chat or a panel like this. What made me feel good about it? Not only the information I can take away, but why was it special? Why is it remarkable? Why do I remember and relate to it? And it's because people listened and they wanted to know more about me and the practices that I do. And so I think about myself, what do I like? And that's how I translate it back to my growers. Growers love to tell their stories. They love to share their practices when you give them an environment that's safe to share in. And that's really not being, don't be judgmental. If there's a practice that you're like, oh my gosh, why on earth would you do that? Ease into it. Don't panic. But meet them where they're at. And that's a piece that resonates with me because I told Abbey she was crazy to have me on this panel because what do I know about communication, right? But she says you're relatable. You get people. You're willing to learn from them. And I think that's what we need to do too, is remember that we are all here at the table for the same reason. No one is better or Lee may be more competitive than others, but we're all here together in this, and that I'm not on a pedestal or any better than the farmers that I work with. I really think about taking a day and walking in their shoes. And fortunately for me, I I still do wear those shoes. You know, I am a farmer and producer myself. And so having that special type of connectivity and relationship is really important. But I understand not everybody can do that or has had that ability. And so just being willing to learn about them as a human, you know, Abby talked about vulnerability and if any time, you know, my background's actually livestock and animal science. And so having me talk about soil health, I didn't think I would fit in or even be a person someone would connect to. But once you start talking about grazing and incorporating livestock with soil health, holy cow, I can go on for hours if you really want me to. And so meeting people halfway at least, getting to know them, find out what makes them tick, what they're passionate about. Those are some really key players that can make a workshop like this or a demonstration or any educational activity, or even one-on-one, can make it so powerful. That'll be one of the strongest relationships you ever make in your life.
That was really powerful. Thank you for that, Angie. That was great. And we've really seen that with the Soil Sense podcast. Inevitably, when we ask a producer to be on the podcast, the first thing they say is, I don't have anything to say. And they say, well, just tell your story. And then they'll say, well, nobody's interested in my story. And then we'll bring them on and we'll get them starting to talk. And then pretty soon an hour's gone by and they'll say, wow, I had a lot more to say than I thought I did, but too bad, none of it's going to be worthwhile to anybody. Then we edit it up and they go, okay, well, actually, that wasn't bad. And whenever I hear that wasn't bad, I think we certainly have got to win. And Lee, I can't see you, but I could just feel you.
Yeah, I just want one. I want to add to this. So one thing, I love what Angie said. Yeah, be a peer, be an equal, understand you have things to learn. I want to reiterate that. And the second thing I want to say, bring your friends. Okay, so when we were preparing for this workshop, I'm going to rat us all out right now on this little point here. We're talking about this, like, what are we going to do? We've never done this before. Bring your friends. I'll be there to bail you out. If you're having trouble, if you're stumbling, there's 4 of us. Somebody's going to be there to bail you out. I think in Zoom, if you're going to try to build conversations, bring your friends. These panels, I think, have been extremely successful, much more so than trying to adapt a PowerPoint to Zoom. Bring your panel. If you have 2 or 3 slides to illustrate something, that's fine, but don't try to cram your presentation into a Zoom. It doesn't fit. But bring your friends with and have that common communication. We're communicating. It's very relaxed. It's very personable. Nobody's making mistakes. We're all calm. I feel better once we got into this. We've spurred the audience into a little bit. I hope they continue. I think that's an incredibly important part of it. Bring your friends, especially if you're new or you don't have that ag background or you don't have the specific background in that. Bring a friend who does, who is with that. Bring a coworker or somebody else that you work well with to help you do those types of things, whether it's at a cafe talk or a person to person or on one of these Zoom calls.
And you might have just answered my next question, Lee, but in case you have more to add on to it, you mentioned something earlier about this can scale. These types of discussions can scale to a lot of people. Could you maybe elaborate on that a little bit? I know, bringing your friends and having a panel would be a great, start to that. But anything else that we need to keep in mind if we want to really scale this connection to a larger audience?
I think you have to try to be a little bit more universal with your types of things in order to scale. You have to understand that not everybody has the vernacular of it. I was thinking about this the other day. How could I say it? I could say, we can decrease water infiltration by smashing aggregates and reducing all of these issues. Or I can say, tillage crushes aggregates and less water gets in the soil. So leave your vernacular off to the side. Leave that content-specific jargon. It's very powerful when you're with a group of people who understand the terminology. It's very distracting if you're with a group of people who do not understand the technology. And that puts distance between you and your audience. And I really I don't recommend you do that. So just how would you explain things in a more universal way, understanding that your audience, the larger your audience gets, the more diverse your audience get. And therefore, you have to be a little bit more common with your presentation.
Thank you for that. Another question from the audience here, and please keep these questions coming. This has been this is going to continue to be a highlight of it, is that we can directly address your questions. And I want to direct this one to Abbey, because I think this speaks to your background. You know, Abbey, you've got a background that is not from agriculture, then you came into ag. And the question is this: do you have any suggestions for non-ag backgrounds to support farmer-led conservation projects by creating farmer networks? And you've done that. Can you talk a little bit more about kind of any suggestions you can offer the audience for that?
Yeah, so I'll start with the story that I usually tell, and I'm a little bit of a storyteller sometimes, like Lee is. And when I grew up outside of Cleveland, Ohio, I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, about as suburbia as you can get. And the only farmer that I ever knew growing up until probably till my mid-30s, to be honest, was old Joe Chismar, who sold sweet corn at his stand by the side of the road. He had 2 acres where he was farming sweet corn. He had a dilapidated shed that was leaning to the side, and he wore overalls. So, right, the quintessential farmer that we see in our coloring books as kids and our storybooks. And that was my experience with agriculture. So when I took this position here at NDSU, I was coming from Virginia Tech, and I had worked with some farmers down there in prime farmland reclamation. And that was kind of piqued my interest in working in agriculture. And I got here and I did not know where to start. I didn't know the difference between a combine and a tractor. I certainly didn't know anything about tillage equipment or any of the equipment. But I needed to learn those things. And the only way I was going to learn those things were some of the best teachers on earth, the farmers themselves. And so by getting in that combine at the time and saying, this is my first ride in a tractor, and the farmer says, no, well, you're still not in a tractor, you're in a combine, was really helpful for me, because that solidified. It gave me a moment in time where I learned the difference between a combine and a tractor. And so, so creating that network of farmers that I go to for, if I get a question about modifying equipment, I go to a certain set of farmers I work with in Lisbon. If I get a question on using cover crops or reducing tillage in a high clay soil, I go to another set of farmers I work with in Wapaton. And building that network, not just for me to get those answers, but then I share that network with other people, and bring them into that network so they have all those resources too, because it can be really overwhelming to be the one person that everybody goes to for that information. And we can't possibly do that. And we can't possibly move forward at the rate we need to move forward, especially with soil health or any other discipline, by being that one person. And so creating that network where you have all these other individuals that can answer these different questions is pretty critical. So it is possible to be a city gal and come out here and try to do agriculture. But I also know too that I can laugh things off if I still don't know the difference between some kind of tillage equipment, or, you know, it's okay to not know those things, and it's okay to rely on other people to share that information on your behalf, or to joke around with you and say, yeah, you know, let me just show you this at Big Iron or the next big farm show. Let me show you that piece of equipment so you understand it. And then there's that two-way conversation. It's you're learning something, they're learning something, you're sharing that information and creating a relationship.
Great. And Angie, I wonder if you could maybe add on to this, as both a producer yourself and an extension agent. If somebody's wanting to come in from the outside and really start to develop those relationships, how receptive are people to, you know, to having a conversation and teaching someone who doesn't know anything about maybe what their operation involves?
Oh gosh. I start by, raising livestock. Every morning you open up that door, there is something outside that is just going to amaze you and shock you. You know, if you thought you knew everything about farming and ranching, there's going to be something that happens with raising livestock, that's for sure. And so that's where I start. I tell my stories. Abbey talked about her specific experience and how she remembers her start with farming. And I think that's where I talk about, I'm honest with them too. I talk about what are some of our struggles. It's, if farming and ranching was so great, everyone would be doing it, right? And not everyone is meant to. And so talking about some of the challenges that we face in agriculture and allowing them to have that aha moment, going, oh my gosh, I never thought of it that way. Thank you for sharing. And so really being honest and talking about why we do things the way we do. You get to this side of North Dakota and the Red River Valley, if I said no-till, they would look at me like I was nuts. And so really having, talking about why we practice certain, whether it's tillage or different seeding practices and things like that, just being open and starting where they're at too. I really like to learn a little bit about their background in terms of, I would have asked something similar to what Abby had talked about. What does farming and ranching mean to you? So that way it kind of gives me a base guide as to where I would like to start the conversation in terms of what's that background base. Do you know milk comes from a dairy cow, not a beef cow? That type of, where are we at so I can meet you there? And you kind of hear me talking. This is a kind of a side note, but I've been repeating some of my main points, and that's on purpose, right? Because I think so many times we have so many messages we want to share, right? We have lots of things we want you to walk away with today, but really at the end of the day, we are all human, and we can only remember so much and take away so many pieces. And so I hope, after today's discussion, you really from my point of view, I really hope you seek to understand, who you're dealing with, who you're talking with, regardless of what you're doing, just knowing where that person's coming from and having that interest. So I apologize that I took that off to left field a little bit, but I just wanted to talk about that too, in terms of getting that key message of what you want.
Yeah. Well, Lee, I want to direct this next question to you because I've seen you do this in practice. Last year at the Dirt Workshop, we had a farmer show and tell, and nobody wanted to show and tell. And you really got out there and made it happen. The question is this: how do you keep cutting edge innovators involved in the conversation and discussion and add value to them during the discussion? So how do you get them to engage and add value? I've seen you do this in action, so I'm going to turn this one over to you.
So I cheated a little bit because I knew those producers, knew them directly, and knew that they had something that they could offer to that conversation. And then I'm the bold guy who just walks up and says, "Hey, Andy, you got something to say here. Here's the microphone, and let's hear what you have to say about this." And it changes the context. And they laugh uncomfortably, and it makes them a little bit nervous. Like, "Hey, it's fine. Don't worry. You'll screw up. It's no problem." So I think part of that is that relationship. It's important to have a relationship with these producers and understand that. And that's part of what my message has been. And Angie ticked on it. We're talking about the same thing again, building that relationship. You can do this in a short period of time. And Abby talked about it at the beginning of a Zoom call. Have an open thing, be human, be honest. Like my 5-year-old's driving me nuts. He's probably going to interrupt the call, so don't be surprised. Or my dogs are going to bark because I know the UPS guy's coming. We're all stuck at this Zoom thing together. We're all in this together. You're not alone. Nobody expects you to be perfect or magical or wonderful. We expect you to be human and honest. If you're honest with people, you'll get a lot farther than if you're trying to pretend that you're better or you don't have problems or everything is going great for you. So just be honest, be open. And one thing I did want to say about folks that are not necessarily, like if you're talking about agriculture and you're not from agriculture, that's a good thing because your perspective is different. You see things different. It's really important for us all to look outside of our professions and ask other people, what did they see? How did they see it? How do you understand it? Get to know what they're concerned about. I've had so many wonderful conversations about agriculture with lawyers and doctors and others at different places and educators who are just asking the questions. They don't know. They don't have firsthand information and their perspective. And I don't know if anybody else has ever done this. When you try to explain it to somebody, you learn something about your profession. Oh yeah, I guess that this is the way to do it. Yeah, thanks for that question. I never really even thought about it. Angie talked about it before. We're not even sure why we've been doing it. And you ask the question, why do you do this? I don't know. So those are conversation starters and get you moving. Great points.
Absolutely. Well, and then the other thing also we did to get people talking was to let them lower the risk to share. So we had them in roundtables and it was a big group, a couple hundred people in there. And so we just said, just share with your table. And then we had someone say, what was the best idea you heard from your table? So, things like that. You want to lower that risk of speaking up and being in front of people. But Lee talked about kind of having those relationships. And I know we've got another question in the chat about well, how do you get those relationships so that you can say, hey, I know, Paul, I know you do this, so talk about it. How do you get from zero to that point? And Abby, I know you've had to do that, moving to North Dakota and starting those relationships from scratch. What's worked for you to have that comfort level with people?
Well, I can certainly say it was easier in person. So the online challenges are very real, and it's going to be very difficult to make those connections. So, the in-person, I could say it was just being available and being accessible and answering phone calls or answering texts and making that visit to their farm to say, I'm interested in what you're doing. I want to see it and I want to learn from it. Online, I'm not quite sure how we're going to do that yet, but I do think that picking up the phone and not doing a Zoom call, but picking up the phone and making an actual phone call is still a very powerful thing. So I think, especially interacting with farmers, with anyone really, that you want to just have that conversation with them, just pick up the phone and talk to them. I think that's going to be our biggest tool is not scheduling big meetings, but doing the one-on-one, take a whole day maybe, and just make phone calls and talk to people and see how things are going.
Yeah.
And also, in doing that, make sure that you're not trying to cram that personal relationship or those connections into a specific amount of time. Like if say you're going to schedule a bunch of phone calls for a day because you want to reach out to different growers, just have that list, but start with the first one, see how long it goes, then go to the next one. And then, don't try to say it, well, I've only got a half hour for this and I've got to get on another call. I think even in the Zoom world, I think there's nothing worse than ending a meeting short or somebody has to leave because they have to get on another call.
Right.
And so trying to keep that open-endedness, that really laid back, flexible approach is maybe going to be key, especially when you can't see them face to face. But yeah, picking up the phone and calling, I think is still going to be one of the better approaches.
Yeah. And one thing I want to emphasize on what you just said too is, let's say you're asked to do a presentation virtually, you don't know anybody. How can you make some connections ahead of time? Can you request who's going to be there and actually find those people online and tweet at them or something? Can you call, people? Could you try to put together a focus group to try to create some sort of relationship? You're not going to be their best friend, but create some sort of relationship beforehand. And we have a few minutes left here in this panel, and we have a few questions in the chat that really focus on, okay, but how do we do all this in an online environment? We have talked about, so much in person, and a lot of the principles are going to apply to both. But Angie and then Lee, anything else that you would want to share about adapting these communication discussions to online environments before we wrap this panel?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question that I don't even have the answer to yet. And maybe those of you out in Zoom land, maybe you have some good suggestions I'd love to see in the chat. But I think it's really setting yourself some ground rules, right? So if we are going to be starting, if this is the route we're really needing to take, and we are, this is why we're here today. I would agree in terms of trying to get to maybe know some of those people prior to your workshop or your event, just to do a little homework, have that understanding and learn a little bit more about where they're coming from and maybe what some of their expectations. Titles can be so deceiving of some of these programs. I see a workshop I want to go to, it's titled to this, it sounds perfect, and I get to it and it's like, yeah, that really wasn't what I wanted to get out of it. So, starting off, and I think we need to be more intentional about not looking at the clock so doggone bad. I mean, like you said, when you have a Zoom meeting, it's 10 to 10:30, that's it, I'm out of here. And that's been really hard because we don't do that in real life. When we have a workshop, we don't, we may wrap up by 10:30, but the conversation lasts longer into the 11 o'clock, if not noon hour. And so, but also being respectful of people's time as well. If they need to go, absolutely, please do. But I think we just need to adapt some of the skills that we already have and just learn to be uncomfortable a little bit. And that's really hard for me, just like we talked earlier, the whole body language piece, right? I mean, I can only see you and Lee and it's just hard not to see everyone. But I will say, Lee had talked about the chat, and some of you had put some chat comments in after I had the opportunity to speak. And I can't tell you how much more comfortable that made me feel. My hands stopped shaking. So I really appreciate that. And so take that into consideration when you're on these things. Support the people that are talking. They're going to think the world of you and that you're really there and you truly care too. And don't be afraid to give some criticism. Absolutely, we all have room for improvement. So I just think that's important. We need to be adapting what we know and figuring out how to get it into this virtual world.
Yeah. Lee, anything to add?
Well, I had it and then I lost it because Angie was so enthralling there that I kind of lost my train of thought there. But I do definitely agree with that. The chat is important. So I do have a couple of things. Talk with the organizer. Ask the organizer who's going to be at this meeting, who's the target audience, where are they going, what do they expect? I mean, do we have farmers and advanced producers? Do we have lay people? Who do we have? Who's the group? Ask them. They're setting it up. Then in the chat, we saw talk about there are several tools about polling people and things you can do into your presentation. During your presentation, I would say do that, adapt that. That bridges the gap between you just talking and them communicating back with you. And it gives them an anonymous way to do that. I think that's really important. And the other thing, and Angie said this really well, don't just be there for your 30 minutes. You're not just a hired gun coming in to talk. If that's all you do, if you roll in 5 minutes before your talk and you're out the door 5 minutes after, you're a hired gun. You didn't want to make any instrument. You didn't want to make connections. You did not want to make things like that. Be there at the rest of the meeting. Be available in chat because people need time to digest these things, to understand what you were saying, what you were thinking. 10 minutes later, 20 minutes later, half a day later, they may have a question for you. Hey, I thought of this when I was talking to somebody else. What do you think about that? Be present at the meeting. These Zoom meetings is easy to jump in and out and in and out and in and out and in and out because you're at home and you can go do something else. Be part of the meeting, be present, be there the whole time. I like that even with in-person meetings. I don't like the person who rolls in right away and then leaves right away. So that's the other thing. That helps you build relationships for the future. Don't just think about your meetings as an isolated incident. If you're working in a demographic, in an area, in a region, in a type of discipline, you're going to see these people again and again and again, and you will build relationships over time. So keep that in mind as well.